Some burdens are too heavy to carry, yet too precious to put down. For 20 years, Roberto Valdez has carried the weight of losing his daughter Isabella in silence. Now, at 70, he's walking 500 miles with her beloved statue of the Virgin Mary. He doesn't talk much to the strangers who stop to help him on the empty highways. His weathered hands shake, but he won't let go. Each step takes him further from the life he knew and closer to something he can't name. The old man isn't sure if he's walking toward peace or just trying to escape his pain. People in the small towns wonder why he's doing this long journey, alone. But what promise did he make to his daughter that's driving him forward after all these years? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The adobe house sat quietly on Calle Luna, its weathered walls the color of desert sand at sunset. Roberto Valdez had built it himself 43 years ago, back when his hands were steady and his heart was full. Now, those same hands trembled slightly as he wrapped the small ceramic statue in an old pillowcase, handling it with the reverence of a man touching something sacred. The Virgin Mary figure was no larger than his palm, painted in blues and whites that had faded over the decades. Isabella had found it at a church bazaar when she was 7 years old, spending her entire allowance on what the priest had called a blessed piece. Roberto remembered how she'd clutched it that day, her dark eyes bright with the kind of faith that only children possess. "Papa, she looks like she's smiling just for me," Isabella had whispered. The memory hit him like it always did, sudden and sharp, leaving him breathless for a moment. 20 years, and he could still hear her voice as clearly as if she were standing beside him. Roberto's living room told the story of a man who had stopped living somewhere along the way. Dust gathered on surfaces that hadn't been properly cleaned. In months, the television sat dark and silent. He'd given up watching the news years ago. Too much sadness in the world, and he carried enough of his own. But the walls were different. They held dozens of photographs, a timeline of better days. There was Carmen on their wedding day, radiant in her grandmother's dress. Roberto at 30, strong and proud, holding infant Isabella like she might break. Family barbecues where everyone was laughing, church festivals where Isabella danced in white dresses, always carrying that little statue. The largest photograph sat on the mantel, the three of them at the feast of Our Lady of Guadalupe when Isabella was 15. She stood between her parents, one arm around each, the Virgin Mary statue visible in her free hand. It was the last picture they'd taken together as a complete family. Carmen would be gone within 6 months, and Isabella would follow. Her mother 5 years later, leaving Roberto alone, with memories and regrets that felt heavier than mountains. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Roberto knew it would be Esperanza before he even looked. His neighbor had been watching him prepare for this journey with growing concern, bringing him extra food and unsolicited advice with the persistence of someone who genuinely cared. "Buenos dias, Roberto," she said as he opened the door. Esperanza. Morales was 72, a widow herself, with silver hair she kept in a neat bun and eyes that missed nothing. She carried a plate covered with a kitchen towel, the smell of fresh tortillas making Roberto's empty stomach respond. "You're still planning this foolishness?" she asked, pushing past him into the house. She'd been calling his pilgrimage foolishness for a week now, ever since he'd told her about his intention to walk to the Santuario de la Virgen in the mountains 500 miles north. "It's not foolishness," Roberto replied quietly, accepting the plate. "It's something I have to do." Esperanza studied his face, noting the determination that had settled there like stone. She'd known Roberto for 15 years, ever since she'd moved next door after her husband died. She'd watched him retreat into himself after Isabella's death, becoming a ghost in his own life. 500 miles, Roberto. At your age, have you lost your mind completely? Roberto unwrapped the statue again, showing it to her. This belonged to Isabella. She loved it more than anything except... He stopped, unable to finish the sentence. Except for us, he'd been about to say. Except for the family that failed. Her when she needed them most. I know what it meant to her, Esperanza said softly. She'd been at the funeral, had held Roberto while he sobbed like a broken man. But walking yourself to death won't bring her back. I'm not trying to bring her back. Roberto's voice was barely above a whisper. I'm trying to... He struggled for the words. How could he explain the weight that pressed down on his chest every morning when he woke up? How could he describe the conversations he'd never had, the signs he'd missed, the daughter who'd slipped away while he was lost in his own grief over Carmen? I made her a promise, he said finally. Before she died, I told her I'd take this statue to the shrine in the mountains. She believed it would help her find peace. Esperanza's expression softened. She reached out and touched his arm with fingers gentle as prayer. Mijo, you can drive there, you don't have to walk. Roberto shook his head. She wanted to walk there herself someday. She said walking was how you showed God you were serious about your prayers. I can't drive. It has to be on foot. The old woman sighed, recognizing the futility of arguing with a man who'd made up his mind. She'd raised 6 children and buried a husband. She knew determination when she saw it. Then I'll pack you better food than whatever you were planning, she said. And you'll call me every night or I'll send the police after you. Roberto managed a small smile, the first genuine one she'd seen from him in weeks. See, I'll call. As Esperanza busied herself in his kitchen, Roberto returned to his preparations. His backpack sat on the dining table, methodically packed with supplies, water bottles, first aid kit, sleeping bag, change of clothes. He moved with the careful precision of a man who'd learned that details mattered, that preparation could mean the difference between success and failure. In his bedroom, he opened the top drawer of his dresser and pulled out an envelope. His name was written on it in Isabella's careful script. She'd given it to him 3 days before she died, making him promise not to open it until he was ready to understand. 20 years later, Roberto still didn't feel ready, but he tucked the letter into his backpack anyway. Tomorrow, he would begin walking north, carrying Isabella's statue and his own desperate hope that somewhere along those 500 miles, he might finally find a way to forgive himself for failing the daughter he'd loved more than his own life. The sun was setting over the desert, painting the sky in shades of gold and orange that reminded him of better days. Roberto stood at his window, watching the light fade, and whispered a prayer to whatever saints might be listening. Help me do this right, he said to the empty room. Help me bring her home. The fluorescent lights in Dr. Restrepo's office buzzed with the persistence of desert flies. Roberto sat on the examination table, his shirt buttoned wrong and his hands folded in his lap like a schoolboy waiting for bad news. He'd only come for his annual checkup because Esperanza had threatened to drag him there herself. Roberto, I need you to listen carefully, Dr. Restrepo said, settling into his chair with the weight of a man about to deliver unwelcome news. They'd known each other for 12 years, ever since Roberto's old doctor retired. Your EKG shows some irregularities. Combined with your blood pressure readings and your family history, I'm concerned about your heart. The words seemed to echo in the small room. Roberto stared at the diploma on the wall, noting how the frame was slightly crooked. Such a small thing to notice when your world was shifting. What does that mean? Roberto asked, though part of him already knew. Dr. Restrepo pulled out a piece of paper and began sketching a simplified heart. You have early-stage coronary artery disease. The arteries that supply blood to your heart muscle are narrowing. It's manageable with medication and lifestyle changes. But Roberto, the doctor looked up from his drawing. No strenuous physical activity, no heavy lifting, and definitely no long-distance hiking. Roberto's chest tightened, and for a moment he wondered if this was what a heart attack felt like. The irony wasn't lost on him, learning his heart was broken just as he'd finally found the courage to use it. How long? Roberto asked. With proper care, years, maybe decades. But you have to take this seriously. One major cardiac event and Dr. Restrepo didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Roberto walked home in a daze, the doctor's letter folded in his shirt pocket like a death sentence. The diagnosis changed everything. Or maybe it changed nothing. Maybe it was just the universe's way of telling him he was running out of time to keep promises he should have kept 20 years ago. That evening he sat in his kitchen with Isabella's statue on the table before him. The ceramic surface was cool, under his fingertips as he traced the Virgin's painted robes. How many times had he watched Isabella do the same thing? How many nights had she fallen asleep, clutching this little figure, whispering prayers he'd been too proud to listen to? The memory came without warning, as they often did. Isabella at 19, home from college for Christmas break. She'd been different that visit, quieter, more fragile somehow. Roberto had been too wrapped up in his own loneliness after Carmen's death to notice the signs. Too busy nursing his grief with silence and tequila to see that his daughter was drowning. "Papa," she'd said one evening, sitting across from him at this same kitchen table, "would you take me to the Santuario de la Virgen someday? I want to walk there like the old pilgrims used to." Roberto had barely looked up from his newspaper. "When I have time, mija, maybe next year." But next year had never come. 3 months later, Isabella was gone, and Roberto was left with the crushing weight of all the conversations they'd never had, all the promises he'd failed to keep. He'd found her in her childhood bedroom on a Tuesday morning, the Virgin Mary, statue clutched in her hands, and a note on her nightstand that simply said, "I'm sorry, Papa. I couldn't find my way back to the light." The funeral had been a blur of flowers and condolences and well-meaning neighbors who didn't understand that sorry doesn't resurrect the dead or heal the wounds that guilt carves into a father's heart. But he remembered standing at her graveside, looking down at the casket that held what remained of his beautiful daughter, and making the only promise he had left to give. "I'll take you to the sanctuary, mija," he'd whispered. "I'll carry your statue there myself. I'll walk every mile you wanted to walk." 20 years of excuses followed. Work was too busy. His back was acting up. The weather wasn't right. Next month would be better. Always next month until next month became next year, and next year became a lifetime of unfinished business. Now, sitting in his kitchen with a heart that might give out before he could make things right, Roberto realized that all his tomorrows had condensed into this moment. Dr. Restrepo's warning echoed in his mind. No strenuous physical activity. But some things were more important than a broken heart. Some promises mattered more than the organ. Pumping blood through his chest, Roberto opened his phone and scrolled to Esperanza's number, then set it down without calling. She would try to talk him out of it, and he couldn't afford to be talked out of anything anymore. Instead, he walked to his bedroom and pulled out the backpack he'd been packing, looking at it with new eyes. 500 miles. At 70 years. Old. With a heart that might stop before he reached the first town. He thought about Isabella's faith, about the way she'd believed that walking was how you showed God you were serious about your prayers. Maybe she'd been right. Maybe the only. Prayers worth praying were the ones that cost you something. Roberto picked up the Virgin Mary statue and held it to the light. The paint was faded, the ceramic chipped in places from decades of loving handling. But the expression on the Virgin's face remained serene, compassionate, as if she understood the weight of promises, kept and broken. "Tomorrow," he said to the statue, to Isabella's memory, to whatever saints might be listening. "Tomorrow we begin." Outside his window, the desert stretched endlessly toward the mountains, 500 miles of heat and hardship and hope. Roberto's heart might be broken, but his resolve had never been stronger. He would walk those miles or die trying. After 20 years of carrying guilt, it was time to carry love instead. The doctor's letter lay forgotten on the kitchen counter as Roberto made his final preparations. Some diagnoses were meant to stop you. Others were meant to set you free. Dawn broke over the desert like a promise kept. Roberto stood at the edge of his hometown, backpack secured, and the Virgin Mary statue wrapped safely in his front pocket. In his right hand, he gripped his grandfather's walking stick, a piece of weathered mesquite wood that had supported 3 generations of Valdez men through hard times. His grandfather, Alejandro, had carved it himself during the Great Depression, when work was scarce and hope even scarcer. "A man needs something solid to lean on," Alejandro used to say, "when the ground beneath him starts to shake." Roberto had inherited the stick when Alejandro died, but had never had occasion to use it. Now, at 70, he understood what his grandfather meant. The highway stretched before him like a river of asphalt, empty except for the occasional semi-truck that thundered past in clouds of diesel exhaust. Roberto took his first step, then another, finding a rhythm that felt manageable. Left foot, right foot, tap of the walking stick, a meditation in motion. By mid-morning, the sun had climbed high enough to make him sweat. Roberto's white cotton shirt clung to his back, and his feet had already begun to protest against the concrete. He'd forgotten how unforgiving pavement could be, how different it felt from the soft earth of his garden, where he'd done most of his walking in recent years. A gas station appeared like a mirage after his 3rd hour of walking. Roberto pushed through the door, grateful for the blast of air conditioning that met him. The young man behind the counter looked up from his magazine, taking in Roberto's backpack and dusty appearance with curious eyes. "You okay, senor?" the clerk asked. His name tag read Diego, and he couldn't have been more than 25. "Just passing through," Roberto replied, selecting a bottle of water from the cooler. The cold plastic felt like a blessing against his palms. "You walking?" Diego gestured toward the highway visible through the windows. Roberto nodded, placing the water and a granola bar on the counter. 500 miles north." Diego's eyebrows shot up. "That's a long way, sir. You sure you're up for it?" The question might have stung coming from someone else, but there was genuine concern in the young man's voice, the kind of respect Roberto remembered from his own youth when elders were treated with deference rather than pity. "My grandfather walked from Mexico to California in 1943, Roberto said, running his thumb along the walking stick's smooth surface. "Took him 6 weeks. He used to say that any journey worth taking was worth walking." Diego rang up the purchases, then paused. "Hold on," he said, disappearing into the back room. He returned with a bottle of electrolyte drink and a small container of ibuprofen. "On the house, for the journey." Roberto's throat tightened with unexpected emotion. It had been so long since anyone had shown him such kindness. "Gracias, mijo. May God bless you." As Roberto stepped back into the heat, Diego called after him. "Hey, senor, whatever you're walking toward, I hope you find it." The afternoon hours passed in a haze of heat and determination. Roberto's grandfather's voice accompanied him, sharing stories that had been passed down like family heirlooms. How Alejandro had walked through dust storms that turned day to night. How he'd slept under bridges and in abandoned barns. Always moving forward, always believing that each step brought him closer to the life he was meant to live. "The stick remembers," Alejandro used to say when Roberto was a boy. "Every step taken in faith leaves something behind for the next person who needs to lean on it." By late afternoon, Roberto's body was sending him urgent messages about rest and shade. His heart felt fluttery in his chest, not quite pain, but a reminder of Dr. Restrepo's warnings. He found a roadside picnic area with a weathered table and bench, grateful for the small patch of shadow provided by a scraggly mesquite tree. Roberto set up his simple camp with methodical care, just as his grandfather had taught him decades ago. Sleeping bag unrolled and smoothed, water bottles organized within easy reach, first aid kit checked and secured. The ritual calmed his nerves and reminded him that he was prepared for this journey, even if his body was protesting. His phone buzzed with a text from Esperanza. "How are you holding up?" "The whole neighborhood is praying for you." Roberto smiled as he typed back, "Day 1 complete. Your prayers are working." It wasn't entirely true. His feet throbbed, his shoulders ached from the backpack, and he was already missing his comfortable bed. But something else was happening too. Something he hadn't expected. With each mile he'd walked, the weight in his chest had shifted slightly. Not disappeared. That would take more than a single day, but loosened, as if the physical act of moving forward was teaching his heart how to do the same. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, Roberto pulled out the Virgin Mary statue and placed it on the picnic table. In the golden light, the faded paint seemed to glow with inner warmth. Isabella had always insisted the statue was special, that it held more than just prayers and paint. "Day 1, mija," Roberto whispered to the figure. 480 miles to go." A memory surfaced. Isabella, at 12, convinced she could, walked to the corner store and back with her eyes closed. She'd made it halfway before Roberto found her, arms outstretched, feeling her way along the neighbor's fence, with complete faith that her feet would find the right path. "How did you know you were going the right way?" he'd asked her. "I just listened to my heart, Papa," she'd replied, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. It knows where it wants to go. Now sitting beside a desert highway with the sun painting the sky in shades of hope, Roberto finally understood what she meant. His heart might be broken in the medical sense, but it still knew where it needed to go. It needed to walk 500 miles north, carrying the memory of a daughter who'd believed in the power of faith and footsteps. Roberto settled into his sleeping bag as darkness claimed the desert. Above him, stars appeared one by one. The same stars his grandfather had navigated by, the same stars Isabella had wished upon as a child. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new miles, new reasons to doubt his ability to complete this journey. But tonight, for the first time in 20 years, Roberto felt like he was exactly where he belonged. Roberto's second day began before dawn, his body stiff and protesting against the hard ground. The desert cold had seeped into his bones, making him grateful for the thermal underwear Esperanza had insisted he pack. He moved slowly, methodically, heating water for instant coffee on his small camp stove and watching the sky lighten by degrees. The rhythm came easier on the second day. Left foot, right foot, tap of the walking stick. His grandfather's cane had developed a comfortable weight in his hand, like an extension of his own arm. Roberto found himself silently counting steps. 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, marking progress in units small enough to manage. Around midday, as he walked through a stretch of highway bordered by scrub brush and the occasional cactus, a county sheriff's car pulled alongside him, emergency lights flashing. Roberto's stomach clenched with worry as the officer stepped out. A woman in her 40s, with steel-grey hair, and the kind of direct gaze that missed nothing. "Sir, I'm going to need you to stop," Sheriff Martinez called out. "Can you tell me what you're doing out here?" Roberto set down his backpack and leaned against his walking stick, trying to project calm despite his racing pulse. "I'm walking to the Santuario de la Virgen, officer. About 500 miles north of here." Sheriff Martinez approached him with professional caution, noting his age, his gear, his obvious exhaustion. "At your age, sir, I have to ask, are you experiencing any confusion or disorientation? Do you know what day it is?" "It's Thursday," Roberto replied calmly. "My name is Roberto Valdez. I live on Calle Luna in Las Cruces. I'm 70 years old, and I'm walking to fulfill a promise I made to my daughter before she died." The sheriff studied his face, looking for signs of dementia or mental illness. Instead, she saw clarity, determination, and a deep sadness that spoke of profound loss rather than confusion. "This is dangerous, Mr. Valdez. The heat, the traffic, your age—" "Officer," Roberto interrupted gently, "I know the risks. I've prepared as well as I can. I have water, food, medication, emergency contacts. I call my neighbor every evening to check in. I'm not trying to harm myself. I'm trying to heal myself." Sheriff Martinez was quiet for a long moment, weighing her options. She could force him. into the back of her car, drive him to the county hospital for a psychological evaluation. She'd done it before with elderly people found wandering highways, but something about Roberto's quiet dignity, the careful way he'd organized his supplies, the genuine clarity in his eyes when he spoke of his daughter, it didn't fit the profile of someone having a mental health crisis. "This promise to your daughter," she said finally. "Tell me about it." Roberto reached into his front pocket and carefully withdrew the Virgin Mary statue, unwrapping it from its protective cloth. Isabella loved this statue. She wanted to walk to the sanctuary in the mountains someday as a pilgrimage. "I promised her I would take it there. That was 20 years ago." The sheriff looked at the small ceramic figure, noting how Roberto's hands trembled slightly as he held it, how his voice softened when he spoke his daughter's name. She'd been a cop long enough to recognize the difference between delusion and devotion. "Mr. Valdez, I can't officially endorse what you're doing. It's not safe, but..." She paused, then reached into her car and pulled out a reflective vest and a small flashing beacon. "Wear these. Stay off the roadway when you can. And here," she handed him a card with her direct number. "Call me if you get into trouble, any trouble at all." Roberto accepted the safety gear with gratitude. "Thank you, officer. Your kindness means more than you know." As the sheriff drove away, Roberto felt a lightness in his chest that had nothing to do with the thin desert air. Someone had looked at his mission and seen purpose instead of foolishness. Someone had chosen to help rather than hinder. The afternoon brought him to a small roadside church, its white stucco walls gleaming in the harsh sunlight. Roberto pushed through the heavy wooden doors and was immediately embraced by cool shadows and the scent of candle wax and old wood. His footsteps echoed in the empty nave as he made his way toward the altar. An elderly priest emerged from the sacristy, moving with the careful deliberation of someone whose knees had given decades of faithful service. "Good afternoon, my son. I'm Father Joaquin. Are you all right? You look like you've been traveling." Roberto introduced himself and explained his pilgrimage. As he spoke, he pulled Isabella's rosary from his pocket, smooth black beads worn glossy by her faithful fingers. He'd found it in her bedroom after the funeral, coiled on her nightstand like a sleeping prayer. Father Joaquin listened without interruption, his weathered hands folded in his lap. When Roberto finished, the priest nodded slowly. "I made a similar journey once, many years ago. After my brother died in Vietnam, I walked from San Antonio to the shrine at Chimayo, carrying his purple heart." "Did it help?" Roberto asked. "The walking helped. The miles between my starting point and my destination gave me space to remember him properly, to sort through the anger and the grief, to find my way back to God." Father Joaquin smiled gently. "But the real healing didn't happen at the shrine, my son. It happened on the road, one step at a time." They prayed together in the quiet church, Roberto kneeling with Isabella's rosary threaded through his fingers. The prayers came easier than they had in years, as if the act of walking had cleared pathways in his heart that had been blocked by decades of guilt and silence. Before leaving, Father Joaquin pressed a small bottle of holy water into Roberto's hands. "For the journey," he said. "And remember, God doesn't require perfect pilgrims, only sincere ones." That evening, Roberto made camp in a rest area 47 miles from his starting point. His body ached in ways that reminded him of his age, but his spirit felt lighter than it had in years. He called Esperanza as promised, describing his encounters with the sheriff and the priest. "People are good," he told her, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. "I'd forgotten that, but they are." As he settled into his sleeping bag, Roberto touched the rosary beads in his pocket and whispered the prayers Isabella had taught him. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new miles, new opportunities to understand what it meant to walk in faith rather than fear. The desert wind carried the scent of sage and possibility, and for the first time since Isabella's death, Roberto fell asleep without the weight of unfinished promises pressing down on his chest. On his 5th morning, Roberto made a discovery that changed everything. He was repacking his backpack after breakfast, methodically checking each item as had become his routine, when his fingers encountered something he hadn't put there. Wedged between his first aid kit and extra socks was a small leather journal, its cover worn soft as cloth. Roberto's hands trembled as he opened it and saw Isabella's familiar handwriting on the first page. "For Papa, when he's ready to hear." My voice again. Isabella. Roberto's vision blurred. He set the journal aside and continued packing, his movements automatic while his mind reeled. Esperanza must have slipped it into his bag before he left. But how long had she kept it? And why now? He waited until he'd been walking for an hour before stopping to read, finding a shaded spot beneath an overpass where he could sit, undisturbed. The journal felt fragile in his weathered hands, as if it might crumble from the weight of 20 years' worth of unspoken conversations. The first entry was dated 6 months before Isabella died. "I know Papa thinks I'm doing better since I came home from college, but I'm not. I'm just getting better at hiding it. The sadness follows me everywhere, like a shadow that's gotten loose from my body. I tried to tell him last week, but he looked so tired, so lost without Mama. How can I add my darkness to his?" Roberto's chest tightened. He remembered that conversation. Or rather, he remembered not having it. Isabella had started to say something. Over dinner, something about feeling sad. But he'd been distracted by bills and grief and the endless weight of trying to figure out how to be a single parent to a young woman who needed more than he knew how to give. "Maybe tomorrow," he'd said, not even looking up from the papers spread across the table. "We'll talk tomorrow." But tomorrow had stretched into weeks, and weeks into the silence that eventually swallowed them both. The next entry made his hands shake. "I found Mama's rosary today, the one with the black beads that she got from her grandmother. Papa had hidden it in his dresser drawer, along with her wedding ring and the letter she wrote to him before the cancer took her. I know I shouldn't have been looking through his things, but I miss her so much, and he never talks about her anymore. It's like she disappeared from our house when she died, like saying her name out loud would make the grief too heavy to carry." Roberto remembered hiding those items, remembered the way looking at them had made his chest feel like it was caving in. He'd thought he was protecting Isabella from his pain, but instead he'd been teaching her that grief was something to be hidden, that love was too dangerous to acknowledge once it had been lost. An hour passed before he could read another entry. This one was written just 2 weeks before Isabella died. "I've been carrying the Virgin Mary statue everywhere with me lately. She feels warm in my hands, like she's alive somehow. I keep thinking about the story Mama used to tell me about how pilgrims would walk hundreds of miles to pray at the sacred places, how the walking was just as important as the destination because it gave them time to sort through their thoughts and feelings. I wish I could walk somewhere far away, somewhere where the sadness couldn't follow me. Maybe if I walked far enough, I could find my way back to the light." Roberto closed the journal and sat in the shade of the overpass, watching. Cars speed past overhead. All those years he'd wondered what signs he'd missed, what words he could have said that might have saved her. Now he knew. Isabella hadn't needed him to solve her sadness. She'd needed him to acknowledge it, to walk with her, instead of hiding from the darkness they both carried. When he was ready, he pulled out his phone and called Esperanza. "You knew," he said when she answered, "about the journal. She gave it to me a week before she died." Esperanza replied softly, "Made me promise to keep it until you were ready to hear what she wanted to say. I hoped that walking those miles might prepare your heart to listen. Why didn't you give it to me sooner?" Esperanza was quiet for a moment. "Because 20 years ago you would have read it as evidence of your failure. Now maybe you can read it as evidence of her love." That afternoon, Roberto encountered a family walking in the opposite direction, a man and woman in their 30s with 2 young children pushing a cart loaded with belongings. They were migrants, he realized, heading south toward the border. He'd crossed in the other direction decades ago. The man approached him cautiously, noting Roberto's age and obvious exhaustion. "Está usted bien, señor? Are you okay?" Roberto nodded, then surprised himself by reaching into his backpack and pulling out one of his precious bottles of water and half of his remaining food. "For the children," he said in Spanish. The woman's eyes filled with tears as she accepted the offering. "Dios le bendiga," she whispered. "God bless you." As the family continued south, Roberto realized it was the first generous act he'd performed in years. Since Isabella's death, he'd been so focused on his own pain that he'd forgotten how good it felt to ease someone else's burden, even in small ways. That evening, he read more of Isabella's journal by the light of his camping lantern. "Papa doesn't know that I can hear him crying at night sometimes. He thinks he's protecting me by being strong during the day, but I wish he would let me help carry his sadness the way he's always helped carry mine. We could walk through this together, if only he would let me." Roberto's vision blurred again. As he read those words, she'd wanted to help him grieve, and instead he'd shut her out, thinking he was being noble by suffering alone. He'd been so afraid of burdening her with his pain that he'd forgotten she was carrying her own. For the first time in 20 years, Roberto spoke Isabella's name aloud without choking on it. "Isabella," he said to the desert stars, "I'm sorry I didn't let you help me. I'm sorry I made you feel so alone." The wind carried his words into the darkness, and somewhere in the vastness of the night, Roberto felt something shift. Not forgiveness. That would take more miles, more time, but recognition. He was beginning to understand that his pilgrimage wasn't just about keeping a promise to his daughter. It was about learning to have the conversation they'd never been able to have while she was alive. Tomorrow, he would walk again, carrying Isabella's words as well as her statue, finally ready to listen to what she'd been trying to tell him all along. On the 8th day of his pilgrimage, Roberto stopped walking and really looked at his wedding ring for the first time in decades. The simple gold band had become part of his hand, as automatic as breathing, but now he slowly twisted it off his finger and held it up to the morning light. The inscription inside was barely visible after 46 years of wear. "Carmen y Roberto. Siempre." Always. Roberto remembered the day they'd chosen the rings at a small jewelry shop in town, how Carmen had insisted on having them engraved, even though they could barely afford the rings themselves. "Words matter, Roberto," she'd said, trying, on ring after ring, until she found one that felt right. Especially the words that live closest to your heart. Now, sitting on a roadside bench with his wedding ring warming in his palm, Roberto finally understood what she'd meant. The word always hadn't been a promise that they'd never die. It had been a promise that love would outlast death, that the connection between them would continue even when one of them was gone. He thought about the years after Carmen's death, how he'd worn the ring like a shield against the world, using his status as a widower to justify his retreat from life. He'd told himself he was being faithful to her memory, but really, he'd been afraid. Afraid that loving anyone else, even his own daughter, might somehow diminish what he and Carmen had shared. The memory came unbidden. Isabella at 18, home for spring break during her freshman year of college, finding him drunk and crying. In the kitchen, on the anniversary of Carmen's death. "Papa, she wouldn't want this," Isabella had said, taking the bottle of tequila from his hands. "Mama wouldn't want you to stop living just because she had to." But Roberto had been too lost. In his grief to hear her, he'd stumbled to his bedroom and locked the door, leaving Isabella alone in the kitchen with his pain and her own questions about how to love someone who'd forgotten how to let himself be loved. Now, Roberto slipped the ring back on his finger, but the weight of it felt different somehow. Not lighter exactly, but changed. Instead of a burden, it felt like a blessing, a reminder that he'd been lucky enough to experience the kind of love that makes you want to promise always, even knowing that always is longer than any human life. His reverie was interrupted by the sound of an approaching pickup truck. The vehicle slowed as it passed him, then pulled over. A man about Roberto's age climbed out, wearing work clothes and a concerned expression. "You okay, friend?" the man asked. "Saw you sitting here and thought you might need help." Roberto stood, shouldering his backpack. I'm walking to the Santuario de la Virgen, about 200 miles still to go. The man, who introduced himself as Arturo, studied Roberto with the eyes of someone who understood physical hardship. That's a hell of a walk for a man our age. You got family that know what you're doing? My daughter would understand, Roberto said, then caught himself. It was the first time he'd spoken of Isabella in the present tense since her death, as if she were still capable of understanding, still present in some way that mattered. Arturo seemed to hear something in Roberto's voice that went deeper than words. Without being asked, he reached into his truck and pulled out a thermos of coffee and a paper bag. My wife always packs too much food. You'd be doing me a favor taking this off my hands. As Roberto accepted the coffee and sandwiches, Arturo asked, "This journey you're making, it's about her, isn't it? Your daughter?" Roberto nodded, not trusting his voice. "Lost my son in Afghanistan 10 years ago," Arturo said quietly. "Marines. For the longest time, I couldn't figure out how to keep living in a world that didn't have him in it anymore. My wife finally told me something that changed my perspective. She said grief isn't the opposite of love. It's love with nowhere to go. The journey you're making, that's love finding its way to where it needs to be." After Arturo drove away, Roberto walked with new purpose. The wedding ring on his finger felt like a talisman now, connecting him not just to Carmen, but to the understanding that love doesn't end with death. It transforms, becomes something that transcends physical presence. That afternoon, he passed through a small town where word of his pilgrimage had somehow preceded him. People stepped out of shops and restaurants to wave, to offer bottles of water, to call out "Vaya con Dios" as he passed. An elderly woman pressed a blessed scapular into his hands. A group of teenagers from the local high school walked alongside him for a few blocks, asking questions about his journey with the genuine curiosity of young people who still believed in the power of dreams and promises. At a local diner, the owner refused to let him pay for his meal. "My grandmother made a pilgrimage once," she said, setting down a plate of food that reminded him of Carmen's cooking. "Walked 200 miles to pray for my grandfather's recovery from tuberculosis. She always said the walking changed her as much as the praying did." That evening, Roberto found a spot to camp near a small creek, the sound of running water providing a peaceful backdrop for his thoughts. He pulled out Isabella's journal and read by the light of his camping lantern. "I've been thinking about Mama's garden today, how she used to say that some plants need to be moved to new soil to grow properly, that sometimes what looks like ending is really just preparation for beginning. I wonder if that's what's happening to me. If this sadness is just old soil that needs to be turned over so something new can grow. But I'm scared, Papa. I'm scared that the new thing growing in me might be too different from who I used to be." Roberto closed the journal and looked up at the stars. The same stars Carmen used to point out to Isabella when she was small, teaching her the names of constellations and the stories behind them. He realized that Isabella had been trying to tell him something important in that journal entry. Not that she was giving up, but that she was struggling to transform, to find a way to grow beyond her grief into something new. Maybe he'd been thinking about her death all wrong for 20 years. Maybe it hadn't been an ending but a transformation, a movement from one form of being into another. Maybe carrying her statue to the sanctuary wasn't about bringing her back, but about completing a transformation that had begun long before she died. Roberto pulled the Virgin Mary statue from his pocket and held it in the starlight. Tomorrow he would continue walking, but tonight he felt something he hadn't experienced in decades, hope that love could indeed find its way to where it needed to be, even across the vast distance between the living and the dead. Roberto's chest felt like someone was squeezing it with invisible hands. He'd been walking for 3 hours that morning when the first wave of pain hit, sharp and radiating down his left arm. He managed to stumble to the side of the road before the second wave knocked him to his knees. A passing motorist found him there 20 minutes later, grey-faced and struggling to breathe, and called 911. The ambulance ride to the regional hospital passed in a blur of oxygen masks and concerned voices, but Roberto maintained a death grip on his backpack, refusing to let the paramedics take it from him. Dr. Patricia Valdez, no relation, despite the shared name, was the cardiologist on duty when Roberto arrived. She was a woman in her 50s, with kind eyes and steady hands, who took one look at his EKG and ordered immediate intervention. "Mr. Valdez, you've had what we call a cardiac event," she explained, as nurses prepared him for treatment. "Not a full heart attack, but your heart is definitely in distress. We need to keep you here for observation and run some tests." "How long?" Roberto asked, his voice weak but determined. "At least 48 hours, maybe longer depending on what we find." Roberto tried to sit up, panic overriding the medication they'd given him. "No, you don't understand. I have to. There's somewhere. I need to be—" "Mr. Valdez, you're not going anywhere right now, except to our cardiac unit." Dr. Valdez's voice was gentle but firm. "Whatever you're trying to accomplish, it's not worth dying for." As they transferred him to a hospital bed, Roberto clutched his backpack like a lifeline. A nurse tried to take it from him, but he held on with surprising strength. "Please," he whispered, "there's something in here I need to keep with me." The nurse, a young man named Carlos, with the patient demeanor of someone who'd learned not to fight battles that didn't matter, nodded. "Okay, but let me check it for safety, then you can keep it beside your bed." As Carlos unpacked Roberto's belongings, his fingers found the Virgin Mary statue wrapped in its protective cloth. He unwrapped it carefully, noting the way Roberto's eyes tracked the small ceramic figure. "This is beautiful," Carlos said, placing it on Roberto's bedside table. "Looks old." "It belonged to my daughter," Roberto replied, his voice barely audible. Carlos continued unpacking and found Isabella's journal. As he placed it beside the statue, a folded piece of paper fell out from between the pages. Something Roberto had never seen before. Carlos handed it to him, noting how Roberto's hands shook as he unfolded it. It was a hospital bracelet, plastic, faded pink, with Isabella's name and a date from 21 years ago. But it wasn't from the hospital where she'd been born, or from any of the few times she'd been treated for minor childhood injuries. This bracelet was from the psychiatric ward of the county hospital, dated just 2 weeks before she died. Roberto stared at the bracelet, his vision blurring. He'd never seen it before, never known about any psychiatric treatment. Isabella had hidden this from him, just as she'd hidden so much of her pain. "Sir?" Carlos asked, noting Roberto's distress. "Are you okay? Do you need me to call someone?" Roberto shook his head, unable to speak. The truth he'd been avoiding for 20 years was written on that plastic bracelet in black ink. Isabella hadn't just been sad or struggling with grief over her mother's death. She'd been clinically depressed, sick in a way that required medical intervention, and he'd never even known. Dr. Valdez returned an hour later to find Roberto weeping silently, the hospital bracelet clutched in one hand and Isabella's journal open in his lap. She pulled up a chair beside his bed, noting the artifacts spread across his bedside table. "Mr. Valdez, I need to ask you some difficult questions. The nurse mentioned you were carrying some items that seem to have upset you. Can you tell me what's happening?" Roberto looked at her with eyes red from crying. "My daughter, she killed herself 20 years ago. I've spent all this time thinking it was my fault, that I failed her somehow. But this bracelet—" He held up the faded pink plastic. "She was getting help. She was trying to get better, and I never even knew." Dr. Valdez studied the bracelet, recognizing the coding from her own residency years at that same psychiatric facility. "Mr. Valdez, this bracelet indicates your daughter was receiving treatment for severe depression. That's not something that happens overnight. She would have been struggling for months, maybe years, before reaching out for help. Why didn't she tell me?" Roberto's voice cracked. "Why didn't I see it? Depression is very good at hiding itself. Dr. Valdez said gently. And 20 years ago, mental health treatment wasn't something people talked about openly. Your daughter was probably trying to protect you, or maybe she was ashamed. That was common then. Roberto closed his eyes, trying to process this new understanding. All these years, he'd carried the weight of believing he'd somehow caused Isabella's death, through neglect or failure. But she'd been fighting her own battle, seeking treatment, trying to get well without burdening him with her struggle. The pilgrimage I was making, Roberto said slowly. I thought I was walking to ask for forgiveness, for her soul, because of how she died. But she was already fighting for her life. She was already trying to heal. Dr. Valdez nodded. Suicide isn't a moral failing, Mr. Valdez. It's what happens when pain exceeds the resources available to cope with it. Your daughter didn't die because she was weak or because you failed her. She died because her illness became stronger than her ability to fight it. That evening, alone in his hospital bed with machines monitoring his damaged heart, Roberto reread Isabella's journal with new understanding. The entries he'd interpreted as cries for help were actually evidence of her strength. Her attempts to manage her depression, to find meaning and hope despite her illness. The promise he'd been trying to keep suddenly seemed different, not a desperate bargain with God to retroactively save his daughter's soul, but a completion of her interrupted journey toward healing. She'd wanted to walk to the sanctuary, not because she was giving up, but because she was still fighting, still believing in the possibility of peace. Roberto looked at the Virgin Mary statue on his bedside table, and for the first time in 20 years, he felt something other than guilt when he thought about Isabella. He felt proud of a daughter who'd fought harder than he'd ever known, who'd reached out for help even when it was difficult, who'd held on to faith even in her darkest moments. Tomorrow, if his heart was strong enough, he would continue, walking. Not to save Isabella, she'd been trying to save herself all along, but to honor the courage she'd shown in fighting for her life until the very end. Roberto was discharged from the hospital with a small pharmacy of medications and stern warnings about overexertion. Dr. Valdez had wanted to keep him longer, but Roberto's quiet determination and surprisingly stable test results had convinced her to let him continue his journey with conditions. You call me if you feel any chest pain, shortness of breath, or dizziness, she said, handing him her card along with a small device. This is a portable heart monitor. It'll track your heart rhythm and send alerts if there are any dangerous changes. Around his neck hung a St. Christopher medal that the hospital chaplain had blessed and given him. For safe travels, Father, Miguel had said. And remember, God doesn't require you to complete every journey you start. Sometimes the wisdom is in knowing when to stop. But Roberto wasn't stopping. Not when he was only 100 miles from the sanctuary. Not when he finally understood what his pilgrimage was really about. As word of his hospitalization spread, something unexpected began to happen. People started gathering along his route. A local news station had picked up the story. 70-year-old man walks 400 miles to honor deceased daughter. And suddenly Roberto found himself with an audience. At first, it made him uncomfortable. He'd conceived of this journey as private, a conversation between himself and Isabella's memory. But as he walked through small towns and rural communities, he began to see something beautiful in the faces of the people who came out to watch him pass. An elderly woman in Deming pressed a bottle of blessed water into his hands. "For my grandson," she whispered. "He's been struggling with the same darkness your daughter fought. Seeing you walk gives me hope that love finds a way." In Hatch, the entire congregation of St. Thomas Church stood outside after Sunday Mass to offer their blessing. As he passed, children threw flower petals in his path, while their grandparents wept openly, remembering their own lost loves and interrupted journeys. Roberto's phone rang constantly now, reporters wanting interviews, family members he hadn't spoken to in Years calling to offer support, strangers who'd heard his story and wanted to share their own. But the call that mattered most came on his 15th day of walking. "Roberto?" Esperanza's voice was thick with emotion. "I'm in Hillsborough. I drove up to meet you." He found her at the town's only diner, sitting in a corner booth with tears streaming down her face. She stood when she saw him, noting how the journey had changed him. He was thinner, weathered by sun and wind, but there was something different in his eyes, a peace she hadn't seen in 20 years. "I had to come," she said, as they embraced. "I had to see for myself that you were okay." They sat together over coffee, and Roberto told her about the hospital bracelet, about his new understanding of Isabella's struggle and courage. Esperanza listened with the patience of someone who'd been waiting decades for this conversation. "She came to me once," Esperanza said finally, "about 6 months before she died. She was crying, said she didn't know how to tell you that she was sick, that she was getting help. She was afraid you had enough pain already." Roberto's throat tightened. "You knew," I suspected, "but she made me promise not to say anything. She said she was handling it, that she would tell you when she was ready." Esperanza reached across the table and took his hand. "Roberto, we all failed her in small ways, but we also loved her in big ways. Sometimes love isn't enough to hold someone here, but that doesn't make the love less real." They talked until the diner closed. 20 years of unspoken grief, finally finding its voice. Esperanza had carried her own guilt, the weight of knowing Isabella was struggling but respecting her wishes for privacy. Roberto had carried his guilt about being emotionally absent after Carmen's death. Both of them had loved Isabella fiercely, but love alone hadn't been enough to save her from an illness they barely understood. "I want to walk the last 50 miles. With you," Esperanza said as they prepared to part ways. Roberto shook his head. "You don't have to." "Not for you," she interrupted. "For her, for Isabella, and for me. I need to complete this journey too." The next morning, they set out together. Esperanza had borrowed hiking boots from her granddaughter and carried a small day pack with water and snacks. She couldn't match Roberto's pace. 20 years of desk work had left her less prepared for long-distance walking, but she kept up with quiet determination. As they walked, they shared memories of Isabella that neither had spoken aloud in decades. Esperanza remembered how Isabella used to help her in the garden, asking endless questions about which flowers attracted butterflies and why some plants grew better in shade. Roberto remembered teaching Isabella to use tools in his workshop, how patient she'd been with measurements, and how proud she'd looked when she successfully built a birdhouse at age 10. "She had such gentle hands," Esperanza observed. "Even as a little girl, she could touch the most delicate things without breaking them." "Like her mother," Roberto replied. "Carmen could bandage a scraped knee so carefully that it almost felt good to be hurt." On their 3rd day walking together, they crested a hill and saw it in the distance. The Santuario de la Virgen, its white walls gleaming against the mountainside like a promise kept. Roberto stopped walking and stared at the sight that had sustained him through 450 miles of desert highways and small-town kindness. "Mira," he whispered to Esperanza, "look how beautiful it is." But when he turned to share the moment with her, he saw that she wasn't looking at the sanctuary. She was looking at him, and her eyes were full of tears. "What is it?" he asked. "You," she said simply. "You're beautiful, Roberto. 20 years I've watched you carry this burden, and now look at you. You're free." He didn't feel free, not yet. But as they began the final descent toward the sanctuary, Roberto felt something he hadn't experienced since before Carmen died. Anticipation. Not the dread of carrying guilt to another day, but the genuine excitement of completing something important. 50 miles ahead, the Santuario de la Virgen waited in the mountains, and somewhere in the space between this hill and that sacred place, Roberto would finally have the conversation with Isabella that 20 years of silence had been waiting for. The final climb began at dawn on Roberto's 18th day of walking. The Santuario de la Virgen sat 2 miles up a winding mountain path, accessible only on foot, and every step seemed to require more effort than the last. His heart monitor had been beeping intermittently since they'd started the ascent, but Roberto ignored it. He was too close now to let his failing body stop him. Esperanza had wanted to attempt the climb with him, but Roberto had gently insisted. This part of the journey was his alone. She waited at the base of the mountain with the small crowd of supporters who had gathered to witness the completion of his pilgrimage. Word had spread through social media and local news, the story of a 70-year-old man walking 500 miles to honor his daughter had touched something deep in people's hearts. The path was lined with stations of the cross, each one marking another stage of Christ's final journey. Roberto paused at each station, not from religious obligation, but because his body demanded rest. At the 3rd station, he stopped longer than usual, his chest tight and his breathing labored. He pulled out the Virgin Mary statue and held it up to catch the morning light. The ceramic surface was warm from being carried close to his heart for 18 days, and the faded paint seemed to glow with inner radiance. For a moment, Roberto could almost see Isabella, as she'd been at 7 years old, clutching this same statue after purchasing it with her allowance money. "We're almost there, mija," he whispered to the figure, to the memory, to whatever essence of his daughter might be listening. "Just like you always wanted." The climb grew steeper as he approached the sanctuary. Each step became a meditation on memory, a recollection of some moment from Isabella's life. Her first steps as a toddler, stumbling across their living room, into Carmen's outstretched arms. Her nervous excitement on the first day of school, clutching a lunchbox decorated with butterflies. Her quinceañera, radiant in a white dress, dancing with Roberto while Carmen wiped happy tears from her eyes. But, mixed with the joyful memories came the harder ones, the ones he'd spent 20 years trying to forget. Isabella at 19, quiet and withdrawn after her first semester at college. Isabella at 20, putting on a brave face during family gatherings, while sadness pooled in her eyes like unshed tears. Isabella in her final months, reaching out for connection in ways Roberto had been too lost in his own grief to recognize. At the 7th station, Roberto's legs gave out completely. He sat heavily on the stone bench provided for pilgrims, his breath coming in sharp gasps. The heart monitor around his neck was beeping insistently now, and he knew Dr. Valdez would want him to stop, to call for help, to prioritize his physical safety over this spiritual journey. But as he sat there, struggling for breath, Roberto remembered something Isabella had written in her journal. Sometimes the most important things require us to push past what feels possible, to trust that our hearts are stronger than we know. She'd been writing about her battle with depression, about the daily choice to keep fighting even when the darkness felt overwhelming. Now Roberto understood that his damaged heart wasn't a sign to stop. It was evidence that some things were worth risking everything for. He stood up slowly, using his grandfather's walking stick for support, and continued climbing. The sanctuary was visible now, its white walls gleaming in the strengthening sunlight. Pilgrims had been making this same climb for over a century, carrying their prayers and hopes up this mountain path, seeking the kind of peace that could only be found in sacred places. As Roberto climbed, he began to hear Isabella's voice, not as memory but as presence. It started as whispers carried on the mountain wind, fragments of conversations they'd had when she was small. Then the voice grew clearer, as if she were walking beside him, invisible, but unmistakably real. "I'm proud of you, Papa," he heard her say. "I'm proud that you kept your promise." Roberto's eyes filled with tears, but he kept walking. "I'm sorry I wasn't there when you needed me most, mija. I'm sorry I didn't know how to help you fight." "You were there," Isabella's voice replied, soft as mountain air. "In every prayer I said, in every moment I held the statue, in every time I remembered how much you loved me. You were always there, Papa." I just couldn't feel it through the illness. The path leveled out as Roberto approached the final stretch. The sanctuary stood before him, its doors open to welcome pilgrims who had traveled far to offer their prayers. Hundreds of candles flickered in the courtyard, each one representing a hope, a prayer, a promise made by someone who believed in the power of sacred places to heal what seemed irreparably broken. Roberto paused at the entrance, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he was about to complete. 500 miles behind him lay his old life, the house on Calle Luna, the 20 years of silence, the weight of guilt that had pressed down on his chest like stones. Ahead of him lay something unknown but no longer frightening. He thought of all the people who had helped him along the way. Diego at the gas station, Sheriff Martinez with her safety equipment, Father Joaquin at the roadside church, Arturo with his thermos of coffee, Dr. Valdez with her gentle truth-telling, and Esperanza with her fierce loyalty. Each of them had been part of this journey, part of the long conversation between love and loss that had brought him to this mountain. The Virgin Mary statue was warm in his hands as Roberto crossed the threshold into the sanctuary. Inside, the walls were covered with milagros, small metal charms left by pilgrims to represent their prayers, hearts for love, hands for healing, eyes for sight, restored. Roberto's own prayer felt too large for any single charm, too complex for any simple symbol. But as he approached the altar where hundreds of offerings had been left by previous pilgrims, Roberto finally understood what his prayer had been all along. Not for Isabella's forgiveness, she had never needed to forgive him. Not for God's mercy, that had been freely given from the beginning. His prayer had been for the courage to forgive himself, to release 20 years of self-imposed punishment, and remember that love doesn't end with death. It transforms, becomes something eternal and unbreakable. Roberto knelt before the altar, his weathered hands shaking as he prepared to place Isabella's beloved statue among the other offerings. This was the moment he had walked 500 miles to reach, the completion of a promise that had taken him 20 years to fully understand. Roberto knelt before the altar, the Virgin Mary statue cradled in his hands like a sleeping child. Around him, the sanctuary hummed with the quiet energy of countless prayers offered by pilgrims who had made their own difficult journeys to this sacred place. Candles flickered in red glass holders, their light dancing across walls covered with photographs, letters, and small offerings left by those seeking healing. As he prepared to place Isabella's statue among the other offerings, Roberto noticed a worn prayer book lying open beside a cluster of candles. Its pages were yellowed with age and thumbed soft by many hands. On the visible page, someone had written in careful script, "For my son David, aged 23, who couldn't find his way back to the light, may his pain be transformed into peace." Roberto's throat tightened as he read those words. Another parent who had lost a child to suicide. Another family torn apart by the kind of invisible illness that steals people from the inside out. He wasn't alone in this grief. He was part of a vast community of love and loss that stretched back through generations of broken hearts and enduring faith. He opened the prayer book to an empty page and, with trembling fingers, wrote, "For my daughter Isabella, who fought harder than I ever knew, thank you for teaching me that love is stronger than guilt, and that promises kept late are still promises honored." As Roberto set the prayer book aside and lifted Isabella's statue, the sanctuary seemed to shimmer around him. The afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows caught the ceramic surface, making the Virgin's painted robes glow like living fabric. For 20 years, Roberto had carried this little figure as a burden, a reminder of his failures as a father. Now, as he prepared to let it go, he finally saw it for what it had always been, a symbol of hope, of faith, of the kind of love that persists even in the darkest moments. "Mija," he whispered, his voice echoing softly in the sacred space, "I brought your statue home. just like I promised. I'm sorry it took me so long to understand what you were trying to tell me." The words he'd held inside for 20 years began to flow like water from a broken dam. "You were so brave, Isabella, braver than your old papa, who was too scared to see how much you were hurting. You fought your illness every day, and you still found ways to love, to hope, to believe that life could be beautiful even when it felt impossible." Roberto's vision blurred with tears, but his voice grew stronger. "I know now that when you died, it wasn't because you gave up. It was because your illness became stronger than your ability to fight it. That's not your fault, mija. That's not anyone's fault. It just is, the way storms are, the way earthquakes are, terrible things that happen in a world where terrible things sometimes happen." He placed the Virgin Mary statue gently among the other offerings, positioning it carefully beside a faded photograph of a young man in military uniform and a child's drawing of an angel with crooked wings. Isabella's statue looked at home there, part of a community of prayers and memories that transformed individual sorrow into collective hope. "I forgive myself, mija," Roberto said, the words feeling strange and powerful in his mouth. "I forgive myself for not knowing how to help you. I forgive myself for being human instead of perfect. And I promise you that I'll live the rest of my life in a way that honors your memory, not with guilt and silence, but with love and connection." As Roberto knelt there, something extraordinary happened. The pain in his chest, not the physical pain from his damaged heart, but the emotional pain he'd carried for 2 decades, began to lift. It didn't disappear completely. He knew grief would always be part of him, woven into the fabric of who he was. But the crushing weight of it, the sense that he was drowning in his own failure, that began to ease. A gentle hand touched his shoulder. Roberto looked up to see an elderly priest, his face lined with the kind of compassion that comes from years of witnessing human suffering and redemption. "She knows," the priest said simply. "Whatever you needed to tell her, whatever you needed her to understand, she knows." Roberto nodded, unable to speak. The priest helped him to his feet and guided him to a bench where he could rest and recover from the intensity of his prayers. Around them, other pilgrims moved quietly through the sanctuary, each absorbed in their own conversations with the divine, their own attempts to transform pain into peace. "I'm Father Santos," the priest said, settling beside Roberto on the bench. "I've been serving this sanctuary for 37 years. I've seen thousands of pilgrims make the journey you've just completed. Each one comes carrying something heavy, and each one leaves something beautiful behind." Roberto looked back at the altar, where Isabella's statue now resided among the other offerings. "I thought I was bringing her here to find peace, but I think maybe I was bringing myself here to find it." Father Santos smiled. "The best pilgrimages work both ways. We think we're carrying our loved ones to sacred places, but really they're carrying us to sacred understanding." As the afternoon light began to fade, Roberto felt a presence beside him, not visible, but unmistakably real. Isabella, as he'd always hoped she could be, free from pain, radiant with the kind of joy that transcends human understanding. She wasn't speaking to him anymore, but he could feel her approval, her love, her deep gratitude that he had finally completed the journey. She dreamed of taking herself. "Go well, Papa," he felt rather than heard her say. "Live well, love well, remember me with joy instead of sorrow." Roberto's heart monitor, which had been beeping frantically during his climb up the mountain, finally fell silent. Not because his heart had stopped, but because for the first time in 20 years, it was beating with the steady rhythm of peace instead of the erratic pulse of guilt and regret. Outside the sanctuary, the sun was setting over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose that reminded Roberto of better days, of family dinners and birthday celebrations and quiet evenings when love felt as natural as breathing. Tomorrow he would begin the journey home, but tonight he would sleep in the pilgrims' quarters beside the sanctuary, surrounded by the prayers of countless others who had found their way to this sacred place. He had walked 500 miles to keep a promise to his daughter, but in doing so he had discovered something even more precious. The promise he needed to make to himself, to live the rest of his life as a man worthy of the love he had been given and the love he still had to give her. The drive home took 8 hours, but it might as well have been a journey to another planet. Roberto sat in Esperanza's passenger seat, watching the landscape roll by in reverse. The same towns, the same stretch of highway, the same desert vista he'd crossed on foot over 18 days. But everything looked different now, as if someone had adjusted the lens through which he saw the world. At his feet rested a small bag containing the few items he'd kept from his pilgrimage: his grandfather's walking stick, Isabella's journal, and something new, a photograph that one of the supporters at the sanctuary had taken of him kneeling at the altar. In the picture, Roberto's face was streaked with tears, but his expression was one of profound peace. It was the face of a man who had finally set down a burden he'd carried for too long. "You're different," Esperanza observed as they passed through a small town where Roberto had stopped for water during his journey. Lighter somehow. Roberto nodded, understanding what she meant. The physical weight of his backpack was gone, but more importantly, the spiritual weight that had pressed down on his shoulders for 20 years had lifted. Not completely. He would always miss Isabella, always wish things had been different, but the crushing sense of failure had transformed into something more manageable. The natural grief of a father who had loved his daughter completely, even if imperfectly. "I learned something," Roberto said, watching a family loading groceries into their car outside a supermarket. "All these years I thought I was carrying Isabella's pain, but really I was carrying my own guilt about not being able to fix her. Pain, there's a difference." Esperanza reached over and squeezed his hand. "She would be proud of you. The journey you made, the courage it took. She would be so proud." Roberto smiled, the first genuinely joyful expression Esperanza had seen from him in decades. "I think she was with me, you know, not in some supernatural way, but in the way love travels with us even when people can't. Every step I took, I was walking with 20 years of memories, 20 years of conversations we'd had, 20 years of love that didn't die when she died." They stopped in several of the towns Roberto had passed through during his pilgrimage, visiting the people who had helped him along the way. Diego, at the gas station, insisted on preparing a care package for Roberto's return home. The congregation at St. Thomas Church in Hatch had prepared a celebration dinner, treating Roberto like a returning hero rather than a grieving father. Dr. Valdez at the hospital hugged him with the fierce affection of someone who had witnessed a medical miracle. Not just Roberto's surviving heart condition, but his surviving grief. "Your heart is stronger than we expected," she told him, after running a final set of tests. "Not just physically, but in every way that matters. You've done something remarkable, Mr. Valdez. You've chosen healing over resentment, love over guilt. That's the kind of medicine we can't prescribe." When they finally reached Roberto's house on Calle Luna, neighbors had gathered in his small front yard. Someone had hung a banner that read, "Welcome home, Roberto," and the local priest was there to offer a blessing for the completion of his pilgrimage. Children who had only heard stories about his journey pressed close to touch his grandfather's walking stick, as if it might transfer some of its accumulated wisdom and strength. But the most meaningful welcome came from an unexpected source. As Roberto stepped out of Esperanza's car, a young woman approached him hesitantly. She was about the age Isabella would have been now, with dark hair and eyes that held the kind of sadness Roberto recognized from his own mirror. "Mr. Valdez," she said softly, "my name is Patricia. I heard about your journey on the news. I wanted to thank you." "Thank me for what, mija?" Patricia's eyes filled with tears. "I've been struggling with depression for 3 years. Last week I was in a very dark place, thinking about ending my pain. But then I saw the story about you walking 500 miles to honor your daughter who died by suicide. It made me realize that even if I can't feel it right now, someone loves me the way you loved Isabella. Someone would walk 500 miles for me too. Roberto's throat tightened with emotion. There is always someone, Mija. Even when the illness makes it impossible to feel that love, it's still there. It's always there. I started counseling. This week, Patricia continued, for the first time I'm getting real help instead of trying to fight this alone. Your walk, it reminded me that asking for help isn't giving up. It's another way of fighting. As the neighbors gradually dispersed and the celebration wound down, Roberto found himself alone in his house for the first time in nearly 3 weeks. The silence that had once felt oppressive now felt peaceful. The photographs on his walls, Carmen laughing at their wedding, Isabella dancing at her quinceañera, the three of them together at church festivals, no longer brought sharp pain but gentle remembrance. Roberto walked through his house, touching familiar objects that seemed subtly changed by his absence and return. In his bedroom, he opened the top drawer of his dresser and pulled out the items he'd hidden there for 20 years. Carmen's rosary, her wedding ring, the letter she'd written to him before the cancer took her. For the first time since her death, Roberto opened Carmen's letter. Her handwriting was shaky from the medications, but her words were clear. My love, when I'm gone, don't let grief make you forget how to live. Isabella will need you to show her that love doesn't end with death. It changes, grows stronger, becomes something that can hold us even when we can't hold each other. Take care of our girl, but also take care of yourself. Promise me you'll remember that joy is not a betrayal of my memory. It's a celebration of all the happiness we shared. Roberto wiped tears from his eyes and carefully folded the letter. Carmen had known what he was only now learning, that love isn't diminished by death, and that honoring the dead doesn't require the living to stop living. 6 months later, Roberto had established a new routine. Every Tuesday evening, he volunteered at a support group for parents who had lost children to suicide. He didn't offer advice or try to fix anyone's pain. He simply shared his own story and listened to theirs, creating the kind of sacred space where grief could be spoken aloud without shame. Every Sunday, he walked, not 500 miles, but a gentle circuit around his neighborhood, often accompanied by Patricia, who had become like a surrogate daughter to him. They talked about Isabella, about depression, about the daily choice to keep fighting even when darkness feels overwhelming. And every morning, Roberto woke up grateful for another day to love well, to live well, to remember Isabella not with the sharp edge of guilt, but with the warm glow of a father's enduring love. The photograph from the sanctuary sat on his mantel now, beside the family pictures that had gathered dust for 20 years. In it, Roberto's face showed the transformation that 500 miles of walking had wrought. Not just the physical changes of sun and wind and weight loss, but the spiritual change of a man who had finally learned to forgive himself. On the first anniversary of his pilgrimage, Roberto returned to the Santuario de la Virgen. This time he drove with Esperanza and Patricia, taking the journey as a celebration rather than a penance. Isabella's Virgin Mary statue still sat among the offerings at the altar, but now it was surrounded by dozens of other items left by pilgrims who had heard Roberto's story and been inspired to make their own journeys of healing. Father Santos welcomed Roberto like an old friend, noting the light in his eyes that had been absent during his first visit. "You look like a man who has found what he was looking for," the priest observed. "I found something better," Roberto replied, gazing at the statue that had carried him through his darkest years. "I found out that what I was looking for was inside me all along. I just needed to walk far enough to discover it." As evening fell over the mountains, Roberto stood outside the sanctuary and looked up at the stars, the same stars that had watched over his 18-day journey from guilt to grace. Somewhere in that vast sky, he felt Isabella's presence, not as the troubled young woman who had lost her battle with depression, but as the eternal daughter who had always loved him, who had never stopped believing in his capacity for healing and growth. "Thank you, Mija," he whispered to the night air. "Thank you for waiting for me to become the father you always knew I could be." The wind carried his words up into the darkness, where they joined the prayers of countless other pilgrims, who had discovered that the longest journeys are often the ones that bring us home to ourselves. Roberto had walked 500 miles to honor his daughter's memory, but in the end, he had traveled an even greater distance, from despair to hope, from isolation to community, from guilt to the kind of love that transcends death and transforms everything it touches. In the quiet of the mountain evening, surrounded by friends who had become family and memories that had become blessings, Roberto Valdez finally understood what his grandfather had meant about the walking stick, remembering. Every step taken in faith, his own journey, would become part of that memory now, adding its weight of hope to the support offered to the next person who needed something solid to lean on when the ground beneath them started to shake. The pilgrimage was complete, but the journey of healing would continue for the rest of his days, not as a burden to be carried, but as a gift to be shared with anyone brave enough to believe that love, once given, never truly ends.